What if one morning you woke up to a life that wasn't yours? Daniel Carter had it all: wealth, power, absolute control. But in the blink of an eye, everything changes. A stranger's question. A world that feels familiar yet completely foreign. A choice that will define everything. Is this a cruel trick of fate, a second chance, or a nightmare he can't escape? Secrets unravel. Love is rediscovered. And the truth? It's nothing like what he expected. Subscribe now and dive into a story where one man must fight for the life he never knew he needed. Don't miss a moment. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Daniel Carter stirred awake as the soft morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his lavish penthouse. The crisp white sheets beneath him were cool, untouched on one side, his side. He sat up, running a hand through his tousled dark hair, before glancing over at the blonde woman still tangled in the sheets beside him. She stretched languidly, her golden locks spilling over the pillow, and flashed him a sleepy smile. "Good morning," she murmured, her voice coated in drowsy satisfaction. Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he reached for the watch on his nightstand, checking the time with casual disinterest. He had an early meeting, and he hated being late. The woman sat up, wrapping a silk robe loosely around her body as she made her way to the kitchen. From the counter, she turned to him, her fingers idly playing with the hem of her robe. "Are you free tonight?" she asked, hopeful. Daniel, already at his wardrobe buttoning up a crisp white shirt, didn't even glance at her. He smirked slightly as he adjusted his cufflinks. "I don't really do the whole dating thing, sweetheart." His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed, as if he had said the same line 1,000 times before. Her face fell for the briefest moment before she quickly masked it with an understanding nod. "Right, of course." He finally turned, giving her a fleeting, impersonal smile before slipping on his tailored jacket. She stepped toward him, leaning in slightly, her lips just inches from his cheek, expecting at least a token goodbye kiss. But before she could close the gap, Daniel had already turned away, grabbing his wallet and keys. "Lock the door when you leave," he called over his shoulder before disappearing through the sleek glass doors of his apartment. The woman stood there for a moment, watching as the sound of his footsteps faded down the hallway. She let out a small sigh, then shook her head. She should have known. Men like Daniel Carter never stayed. The city buzzed with the early morning rush as Daniel Carter's sleek black town car slid effortlessly through the streets of Manhattan. Inside, he sat with one leg crossed over the other, his phone in one hand, skimming through stock reports while his assistant, a sharp-dressed young man named Tyler, read through his schedule. "Don't forget, sir, the company Christmas party is tonight at the Waldorf," Tyler reminded him. "Everyone's expecting you to make an appearance." Daniel didn't even look up. "Pass." Tyler hesitated. "Sir, it's a tradition. You're the CEO. And what exactly do I gain from standing around sipping overpriced champagne with people I already pay to work for me?" Daniel replied flatly, still scrolling through his phone. Tyler exhaled through his nose but didn't argue. There was no changing Daniel's mind when it came to things he considered pointless. As the car pulled up to the towering steel and glass facade of Carter Holdings, Daniel stepped out, barely acknowledging the doorman who greeted him with a polite, "Good morning, Mr. Carter." His long strides carried him through the marble lobby and into the private elevator reserved for executives. Inside, a few employees joined him, junior analysts, some mid-level managers. They stood stiffly, intimidated by his presence. "Morning, Mr. Carter," one of them ventured cautiously. Daniel gave a perfunctory nod, just enough to acknowledge the effort, but not enough to encourage further conversation. As the elevator ascended, a younger employee, perhaps in his late 20s, turned to his colleague with an excited grin. "She said yes," the man announced. "I proposed last night." A few others in the elevator clapped him on the back, offering their congratulations. The young man beamed, clearly caught up in the glow of his engagement. Daniel finally looked up from his phone, raising an eyebrow. "Congratulations," he said smoothly, then added, "but I'll bet you anything. In 3 years, you'll regret it." The elevator fell into awkward silence. The newly engaged man chuckled uncomfortably. "Uh, hopefully not, sir." Daniel smirked. "Trust me, first everything is perfect. Then little things start to annoy you. Her habits, her expectations. One day you wake up and realize that you miss your freedom. But by then, it's too late. You're in too deep. Marriage, my friend, is just a slow, expensive way to complicate your life. No one spoke. The elevator doors slid open to the executive floor, and Daniel strode out without another word. For him, love was an illusion, a temporary high, a deal people made without reading the fine print. And marriage? That was just another contract, one that was nearly impossible to get out of without losing half of everything you had. That evening, as Daniel left his office, the streets of New York were dusted with fresh snow. The city sparkled under the glow of streetlights and festive decorations, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were occupied with business. Deals closed, stocks rising, his relentless climb to the top. His driver had the car waiting for him, but for some reason, Daniel felt the urge to walk. Maybe it was the cold air, crisp and biting, that cleared his mind. Maybe it was the dull predictability of his routine that made him crave a change, even something as small as a detour. He adjusted his cashmere coat, shoving his hands into the pockets, and strolled down the quiet street near his building. As he turned a corner, a movement in the alley caught his eye. An old man hunched over was struggling to push a battered garbage cart through the slushy snow. The wheels were stuck, refusing to budge against the icy pavement. Daniel never stopped for things like this. He had walked past countless panhandlers, ignored every plea for spare change. But tonight, for some reason he couldn't quite explain, his feet hesitated. The old man grunted, adjusting his grip, but the cart didn't move an inch. Snowflakes clung to his threadbare coat, his gloves worn and frayed. Daniel sighed, rolling his eyes at himself. Then, before he could change his mind, he stepped forward. "Here," he said, reaching for the side of the cart. "You need a hand?" The old man looked up in surprise, then nodded. Together they pushed, and after a few firm shoves, the wheels finally broke free from the ice. The cart lurched forward. The old man exhaled, straightening up. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice raspy but warm. He studied Daniel for a long moment, then smiled, a slow, knowing grin. "You're a good man." Daniel let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Don't say that," he replied. "I don't do anything without a reason." The old man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then he met Daniel's gaze, his eyes sharp despite his age. "Do you need any help?" he asked. Daniel frowned. "What? Do you need any help?" the old man repeated, his voice soft but firm, as if he already knew the answer. Daniel barked out a laugh. "I have everything I need, old man," he said, shaking his head. The old man didn't argue. He just smiled again. Wider this time, almost as if he knew something Daniel didn't. Then, without another word, he turned back to his cart and continued down the alley, the squeaky wheels echoing in the stillness of the night. Daniel stood there for a moment, watching him disappear into the darkness. A strange feeling settled in his chest, one he couldn't quite place. Then he shrugged it off, pulling his coat tighter around himself as he continued home, convinced that by morning he would forget the encounter ever happened. Daniel stepped into his penthouse, the automated lights flickering on as he entered. The city skyline stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a breathtaking display of shimmering buildings and the soft glow of falling snow. It was the kind of view people dreamed about, the kind of life most would kill to have. And yet, as he shrugged off his coat and tossed it carelessly over the back of a chair, Daniel felt nothing. He walked to the sleek marble counter of his kitchen, grabbed a bottle of expensive red wine, and poured himself a glass. The rich aroma filled the air, but as he took a sip, it tasted the same as every other night, smooth, predictable, forgettable. With the glass in one hand, he settled onto his leather couch, flipping open his laptop. The familiar stock charts and numbers filled the screen, lines rising and falling, money shifting hands in ways only a select few truly understood. This was his world. Numbers, power, control. But for some reason, he couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting, to the old man in the alley, to the odd way he had smiled, to the strange question he had asked. "Do you need any help?" Daniel scoffed at the memory, shaking his head as he took another sip of wine. What a ridiculous thing to ask. He was Daniel Carter. He didn't need help. He had built his life exactly the way he wanted it. Successful, untouchable, free from attachments. Then why did the question still linger in his mind? With a frustrated sigh, he snapped the laptop shut and set the wine glass down, half full, on the table. Maybe he was just tired. That was all. Just another long day. He loosened his tie, made his way to the bedroom, and collapsed onto the king-size bed. The sheets were cold, the room silent except for the distant hum of the city below. As he closed his eyes, the weight of exhaustion finally took over, pulling him into sleep. But something felt different. The silence felt too deep, the darkness too thick. And just before his mind slipped away completely, he thought he heard something, soft, distant, like a whisper. "Are you sure you have everything you need?" Then nothing. Daniel jolted awake, his heart pounding. The first thing he noticed was the cold air, not the controlled, artificial coolness of his penthouse, but a raw chill seeping through the walls. The second thing was the mattress beneath him, thin, slightly lumpy, nothing like the memory foam luxury he was used to. His eyes snapped open. The room was small, almost claustrophobic. The walls were painted a dull beige, scuffed with years of wear. A wooden dresser sat in the corner, its surface cluttered with children's drawings, a coffee mug, and a framed photo of a family. A man, a woman, 2 kids. Daniel frowned. This wasn't his room. Panic rose in his chest as he sat up, the unfamiliar sheets tangling around his legs. His head felt heavy, fogged, like he had been drugged. His hand went instinctively to his phone, except it wasn't there. Before he could process anything further, a soft voice interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Come on, sleepyhead," a woman's voice said, with a teasing lilt. "You're going to make the kids late for school." Daniel turned toward the doorway and froze. Standing there, wearing an oversized sweater and an easy smile, was Emily. Emily Lawson, a name he hadn't spoken in over a decade, a face he hadn't seen in years. She looked almost exactly the same, her warm brown eyes, the dimple that deepened when she smiled, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear without thinking. But there was something else too, something softer, more mature. She wasn't just Emily anymore. She was Emily, his wife. The realization hit him like a freight train. His eyes flickered down. She was wearing a wedding ring. So was he. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. "What the hell?" Emily tilted her head, amused by his stunned expression. "Are you okay?" she asked, stepping closer, her brows knitting together slightly. Daniel opened his mouth. No words came out. His mind scrambled for an explanation. This was impossible. It had to be a dream, a vivid hallucination. He had fallen asleep in his penthouse, in his own bed, in New York. But this was not New York. His breath came in short, uneven bursts. He gripped the edge of the bed, half expecting the illusion to shatter. Emily gave him a playful nudge. "Come on, Carter," she said, chuckling. "You've had the same morning routine for years. Get dressed, grab coffee, and drive the kids to school. Don't tell me you forgot." Daniel's head snapped up. Kids? Before he could say anything, a blur of motion came barreling into the room. "Daddy!" A little girl, no older than 6, leaped onto the bed, throwing her arms around him. She smelled like vanilla shampoo and cereal. Daniel flinched. His body stiffened instinctively, his hands hovering awkwardly, unsure of what to do. "Daddy, wake up!" the girl demanded, laughing as she bounced on the mattress beside him. "We're gonna be late." Daniel stared at her, his brain completely short-circuiting. His daughter. A boy, maybe 9, appeared in the doorway, arms crossed with an impatient expression. "Mom, tell Dad to move. We're gonna miss the bus." His son, Daniel Carter, billionaire, CEO, self-proclaimed lone wolf, had a wife, a house, children. This was wrong. This was impossible. And yet, it was happening. Daniel's breath came in short, ragged gasps. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it echoing in his ears. He needed to get out, now. Without a word, he threw off the blankets and practically stumbled out of the bedroom. His bare feet hit the wooden floor with a thud as he rushed down the narrow hallway. The air smelled of coffee and toasted bread, of a life that wasn't his. The house was tiny, nothing like his sleek penthouse. The walls were lined with framed photos of him and Emily, smiling together, holding hands, standing at what looked like a beach. There were pictures of the kids grinning with missing teeth, blowing out birthday candles. Daniel's pulse spiked. This wasn't just some mistake. This was a life, a fully formed, lived-in life. His eyes darted around. The living room was cluttered with toys, tiny dolls, plastic dinosaurs, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table. His expensive Italian leather shoes were nowhere to be found. Instead, a pair of well-worn sneakers sat by the front door. He turned wildly, catching sight of himself in a mirror near the hallway, and his stomach dropped. The man staring back at him was still Daniel Carter, but not the Daniel he remembered. Gone was the sharply tailored suit, the perfectly styled hair, the crisp, clean-shaven jawline. Instead, he wore a simple gray t-shirt and sweatpants. His hair was slightly messy, his face bore faint signs of exhaustion, and most horrifying of all, he looked normal. His breathing turned shallow. No, 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 no. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. Emily's voice rang out from the kitchen. Daniel, you okay? He didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he turned, fumbling with the front door before yanking it open. Cold air slapped him in the face as he stumbled outside. The neighborhood was unrecognizable. Snow-covered driveways, modest houses lined in a neat little row, Christmas decorations twinkling from porches. This wasn't New York. This wasn't his world. He needed to get out. Now. Spotting a taxi idling near the curb, Daniel sprinted toward it, his breath coming out in frantic puffs. He flung open the door and slid inside, gasping out, "Take me to Manhattan, now!" The driver, a burly man in his 50s, turned to look at him like he'd just asked to be flown to Mars. "Manhattan?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You serious?" "Yes, just go. I'll pay whatever you want," Daniel snapped. The driver let out a low whistle. "Buddy, you do realize that's about 200 miles from here, right?" Daniel's body went still. 200 miles. That wasn't possible. He turned slowly, staring out the window. The skyline of New York City was nowhere to be seen. Instead, there were rolling hills, quiet suburban streets, and a sky untouched by towering buildings. This wasn't just another part of town. He was nowhere near New York. His stomach twisted, nausea creeping in. "Still want to go?" the driver asked, watching him in the rearview mirror. Daniel didn't answer. His fingers dug into his knees as the full weight of reality crashed over him. He wasn't just in the wrong house, he was in the wrong life. Daniel had no choice but to trudge back to the small house he apparently called home. His mind was still spinning, his pulse still erratic, but there was nowhere else to go. 200 miles away from New York, no wallet, no phone, no way out. Emily greeted him with a bemused smile as he stepped through the door, his socks wet from the snow. "Where did you run off to?" she asked, setting a steaming mug of coffee on the kitchen counter. Daniel barely managed a grunt in response. He didn't know how to act, what to say. Then just as he was about to sit down and process this nightmare, Emily clapped her hands together and said, "You better get going. You're already late for work." Daniel's brow furrowed. "Work?" Emily gave him a look. "Yes, work. Your job? The thing that pays for our house? Don't tell me you forgot that too." Before he could respond, she tossed him a navy blue jacket embroidered with a name tag. He caught it, turned it over in his hands, and felt his stomach drop. The patch read, "Carter's Auto Repair." Daniel froze. No, 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 no. This had to be some kind of joke. Emily was already pushing him toward the door. "Come on, go before Gus chews you out again. I packed you lunch." Lunch, work, a name tag, a garage. Daniel Carter, CEO, billionaire, was a mechanic. The garage smelled of oil, rubber, and sweat. It was loud, chaotic, nothing like the pristine silence of his corporate office. Engines roared, tools clanked, and somewhere a radio played classic rock at full volume. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, completely out of his element. A stocky man with a thick beard spotted him and let out a sharp whistle. "Carter! Finally decided to show up, huh?" Daniel blinked. Uh, the man, Gus, his boss apparently, crossed his arms. "We got a packed schedule today, so stop standing around like a damn mannequin and get to work." Daniel had no idea what he was supposed to do. He hesitated, looking around for some kind of instruction, but no one was paying him any mind. "All right," he muttered under his breath. "How hard can this be?" It was hard. Within the first 30 minutes, Daniel had overfilled an oil tank, causing it to spill all over the floor, tried to remove a tire using the wrong tool, which resulted in the tire flying off and nearly hitting another worker, dropped an entire toolbox, scattering wrenches and screws across the shop floor. It was an unmitigated disaster. Gus, red-faced and fuming, stormed over. "Carter, what the hell is wrong with you today?" he barked. Daniel opened his mouth, tried to come up with an excuse, but he had nothing. What was he supposed to say? "Sorry, I used to be a billionaire, not a grease monkey?" Before he could speak, a grimy-looking mechanic with a smug smirk sauntered over. "Boss, I think Carter hit his head this morning," the guy drawled, arms crossed. "Or maybe he finally realized he sucks at this job." A few workers snickered. Daniel clenched his jaw. His entire life, he had never been humiliated like this. No one had ever spoken to him this way, and yet here he was, just another guy in a name-tagged uniform, failing at the one job he never imagined he'd have. That evening, Daniel sat stiffly at the dinner table, staring at the plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes in front of him. It wasn't that the food looked bad. On the contrary, it smelled homemade and comforting. But nothing about this felt real. Across from him, his daughter, the little girl who had tackled him that morning, was watching him suspiciously. Her tiny hands gripped her fork, but she hadn't taken a single bite. Emily, sitting beside him, was chatting casually about her day, but Daniel barely heard a word. His mind was still reeling from his disastrous day at the garage. The humiliation, the exhaustion, the realization that he had no way out of this nightmare. Then the little girl suddenly spoke up. "Mom," she said, eyes narrowing as she stared at Daniel. "I think Daddy got body snatched." Daniel blinked. "What?" Emily let out a small laugh. "Honey, what are you talking about?" The girl leaned in, her tiny face full of concern. "He's acting weird," she whispered, as if Daniel couldn't hear her. "Like, extra weird." Daniel stared at her, unsure whether to be amused or completely horrified. "Sweetheart," Emily said, reaching over to brush a hand through the girl's curls. "Daddy's just tired." The girl wasn't convinced. She pointed a tiny finger at him. "No, that's not Daddy." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This was getting absurd. "I am your dad," he said, forcing a reassuring smile. "See, I'm sitting right here." The girl squinted. "Okay, then what's my favorite color?" Daniel's smile froze. His mind went blank. "Oh, crap." Emily gave him a curious look, clearly expecting an answer. "Say pink. Kids love pink." Pink?" he guessed. The girl gasped. "It's purple!" she shrieked, looking at Emily like she had just solved a crime. "I told you, it's not Daddy!" Emily chuckled, shaking her head. "She's just being silly," she said, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes as she turned back to Daniel. "You are acting a little off today." Daniel felt a bead of sweat form on his temple. He needed to change the subject. "So," he said, grabbing his fork and forcing himself to take a bite of the meatloaf. "This is great, really good." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You hate meatloaf," Daniel coughed. "Well, maybe I used to, but..." Before he could finish, a baby's cry echoed from another room. Emily sighed, standing up. "I'll get him." "No, I got it," Daniel blurted out, desperate to prove himself. Emily hesitated. "Are you sure?" Yeah, I got it," he said quickly, pushing his chair back. How hard could it be? The moment he stepped into the nursery, he regretted everything. A toddler, probably a year old, was standing in his crib, wailing at the top of his lungs. His little face was red, tiny fists clenched, absolutely furious about something. Daniel hesitated. What did babies even want? Hey, buddy, he said awkwardly, stepping closer. The toddler screamed louder. Daniel's hands hovered over him. Was he supposed to pick him up? Pat him? Give him food? Then he caught sight of something truly horrifying. A diaper. Oh no, he muttered. The baby stared at him, sniffling, his little face a picture of betrayal. Daniel gritted his teeth. All right, Carter. You run a multi-billion-dollar company. You can handle a stupid diaper. 5 minutes later, Daniel stood frozen, completely outmatched. The baby lay on the changing table, half diapered, half covered in baby powder, still crying. Emily suddenly appeared at the doorway, gasping at the disaster scene before her. "Oh my God," she said, covering her mouth. What happened in here?" Daniel, still gripping a wet wipe like it was a weapon, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Listen," he said. "I tried." Emily exhaled, laughing despite herself. She stepped in, expertly fastening the diaper in one swift motion. Daniel glared. "That's not fair. You've had practice." Emily shook her head, watching him for a long moment. "You're really not yourself today, huh?" Daniel hesitated. He wanted to say something sarcastic, brush it off, but the concern in her voice made his chest tighten. Was she starting to notice? "I'm fine," he muttered, but even he didn't believe it. Daniel couldn't accept this. This wasn't his life. The moment Emily turned her back, he grabbed his coat and rushed outside, ignoring the icy wind that cut through his thin sweater. He needed answers. He needed to find that old man. His mind raced as he retraced his steps from the night before. The alley, the garbage cart, the strange way the old man had smiled at him. "Do you need any help?" Daniel gritted his teeth. He should have known something was wrong the moment those words left the old man's mouth. He turned down the same street where they'd met, his breath fogging in the cold air. But the alley was empty. No garbage cart, no old man, just a few stray pieces of trash rolling in the wind. Daniel frowned. He checked both ends of the street. Nothing. A man in a heavy coat walked by, and Daniel lunged forward, grabbing his arm. "Hey, there was an old guy here last night. He had a cart, dirty coat, kind of weird smile. Have you seen him?" The man jerked away, startled. "What the hell, man?" Daniel ignored his reaction. "He was right here. I helped him push his cart. Old guy, probably in his 70s. "Do you know him?" The man shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about. No one like that hangs around here." Daniel's stomach sank. That wasn't possible. He ran to the nearest store, a small corner deli. The owner, an older woman, was stocking shelves. "Hey," he said, nearly breathless. "The old man, the one who collects trash. You must have seen him. He was here last night." The woman gave him a confused look. "I've worked here for 10 years, honey. No one like that comes around here." Daniel's chest tightened. "No, that's not right. He was here. I saw him." The woman shook her head, already losing interest. "Maybe you were dreaming." Dreaming. Daniel stumbled back onto the sidewalk, his pulse hammering in his ears. This wasn't right. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He rushed to another street, then another. He asked a taxi driver, a group of teenagers, even a homeless man sitting outside a liquor store. No one had seen the old man. It was like he had never existed. Daniel pressed his hands to his temples, his breath shaky. His world, his real world, was gone. No penthouse, no company, no way out. And worst of all, no one believed him. The days dragged on, each one a reminder of the life Daniel had lost. At first he fought it. He resisted the routine, snapped at the mundane responsibilities, and searched desperately for a way out. But with every passing day, with every failed attempt to escape, the weight of his new reality pressed down harder. Then one evening, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. Daniel had just come home from another miserable shift at the garage, his hands stained with grease, his back aching from hours bent over cars. The moment he stepped inside, the smell of dinner filled the air. Something warm, something familiar. He had never cared much about home-cooked meals before. But after eating dry sandwiches in a cramped break room, the scent was almost comforting. He expected to find Emily bustling around the kitchen the way she always did when he got home. Instead, as he stepped into the dimly lit living room, he saw her sitting on the couch, her head in her hands. She was crying. Daniel froze. Emily never cried, at least not in front of him. For the first time since waking up in this new life, he really looked at her. Not just as the woman from his past, not just as the wife he had somehow ended up with, but as a person. Her hair was messily tied back, strands falling loose around her face. Her sweater was stained with something. Baby food, probably. The sleeves of it were pulled over her hands, fingers gripping the fabric as she tried to steady her breathing. She looked exhausted. Not just physically, but something deeper. The kind of tired that seeps into your bones. Daniel stood there, unsure of what to do. A part of him wanted to turn away. This wasn't his problem. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to care. But something about the way her shoulders shook made his chest tighten. He took a hesitant step closer. "Emily," she startled, quickly wiping at her face before looking up. For a second, she looked embarrassed. "Oh," she said, forcing a small, tired smile. "I didn't hear you come in." Daniel hesitated. "Are you okay?" Emily let out a small, humorless laugh. Yeah, I'm fine." She sniffled, running a hand through her hair before shaking her head. "It's just, God, some days are so hard." She gestured vaguely toward the mess of toys scattered around the room. The baby monitor sitting beside her, the stack of unpaid bills on the coffee table. "I didn't even have time to shower today. The kids were both sick this morning, and Liam threw up in the car, and then the dishwasher broke, and—" She cut herself off, squeezing her eyes shut. I feel like I'm drowning." Daniel didn't know what to say. Emily wasn't supposed to be like this. In his memories, she had been sharp, ambitious, untouchable. She had dreams, law school, a career, a future. But here she was, exhausted, overwhelmed, giving everything she had to a family that he didn't even remember being a part of. And suddenly, for the first time, it hit him. She had given up everything for this life, for him, for their kids. Daniel swallowed hard. He shifted awkwardly, running a hand through his hair. "You need me to do something?" Emily looked at him, surprised. Then she gave him a small, tired smile. "Can you just hold the baby for a bit?" she asked softly. Daniel hesitated. Then, before he could overthink it, he nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I can do that." And for the first time since waking up in this life, he did something not because he had to, but because he wanted to. That night, after another long, exhausting day, Daniel found himself lying stiffly in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet now, the kind of quiet that only comes after a long battle of bedtime negotiations. The baby had finally stopped crying, Emily had retreated to their room, and his son had shut the door to his own space, probably buried in whatever kids his age did before bed. But there was still one person awake. A small, warm body suddenly climbed into the bed beside him. Daniel flinched slightly as his daughter wiggled under the covers, pressing herself close against his side. He had barely gotten used to having children, let alone one that seemed to have no concept of personal space. "What are you doing?" he asked, keeping his voice low. She yawned, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "I had a bad dream." Daniel blinked. "And?" She huffed, like he had just asked the dumbest question in the world. "And I don't want to sleep alone." She said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, like it was the most natural thing in the world for her to climb into bed with him. Like she had always done this. Daniel hesitated. Everything in him screamed that this was too much, too close, too unfamiliar. And yet, as she curled up beside him, tiny fingers gripping the fabric of his t-shirt, something inside him shifted. She was so small, so fragile. For years, Daniel had believed that money was the key to happiness, that success meant power, control, independence. He had everything a man could want: wealth, luxury, absolute freedom. And yet, as he lay there in a small, messy house with a little girl tucked into his side, trusting him completely. He felt something he had never felt before, something terrifying, something real, a kind of happiness that had nothing to do with money at all. His daughter let out a small sigh, already half asleep. "I love you, Daddy," she murmured. Daniel's throat tightened. The words hit harder than he expected. For a moment, he couldn't say anything. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the warmth of her tiny frame pressed against him. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he forced out, "Yeah, I love you too, kid." And for the first time since waking up in this life, he wasn't lying. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, or at least what had become ordinary for Daniel. He had just finished a shift at the garage, his hands still stained with grease, exhaustion clinging to him like a second skin. But for once, he didn't hate it. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't power. But it was real. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, brushing snowflakes from his jacket, he saw him. The old man, standing casually by a lamppost, hands tucked into his coat pockets, a knowing smile on his face. Daniel froze. His pulse quickened. A rush of emotions flooded him. Relief, confusion, dread. He had searched for this man for weeks, convinced he was the key to escaping this nightmare. Now that he was here, Daniel wasn't so sure he wanted answers anymore. The old man chuckled as if he could see the storm raging inside him. "Well," he said, his voice calm, steady, "you've had quite the journey, haven't you?" Daniel swallowed hard. His throat felt dry. "What the hell is happening to me?" he demanded, though his voice lacked the sharpness it once had. The old man tilted his head slightly. "Have you learned anything yet?" Daniel clenched his fists. A month ago, he would have scoffed at the question, would have dismissed it as nonsense. But now he had a wife who looked at him like he meant the world, a son who asked for his advice, a daughter who curled up beside him at night, completely trusting him to protect her. A life that wasn't built on money, power, or control, but on something deeper. And for the first time in his existence, Daniel wasn't sure if he wanted to let it go. The old man's eyes softened. "It's time for you to make a choice, Daniel." Daniel felt his heart lurch. "What do you mean?" "You can go back," the old man said simply. "Back to your world, your penthouse, your empire, everything you left behind." Daniel inhaled sharply. This was it, the thing he had been waiting for, the escape. But why did it suddenly feel like a trap? "What if I stay?" he asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The old man smiled. "Then you stay." Daniel's chest tightened. He thought about the life he had built before, the freedom, the success, the power. Then he thought about Emily, his kids, the way his daughter clung to him in her sleep, the way his son looked up to him, the way Emily's tired eyes softened when he made her laugh. He had spent his entire life believing that happiness was something you bought, something you earned. Now he wasn't so sure anymore. His hands trembled as he exhaled. He had never been more terrified in his entire life. Because for the first time ever, Daniel Carter didn't know what he wanted. Daniel's breath came out in short, shaky bursts, his entire body tense with indecision. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the way out. He could already picture it. His sleek penthouse, his morning espresso overlooking the New York skyline. The silent power of walking into a boardroom where everyone hung on his every word. No more grease-stained hands. No more baby cries at 3 a.m. No more struggling to make ends meet. No more Emily. No more Liam. No more Maddie. A sharp pang twisted in his chest. For weeks, all he had wanted was to escape this life, to wake up and find it had all been a bad dream. But now he wasn't sure if he could bear leaving it behind. He pictured Maddie's tiny arms wrapped around his neck. He pictured Liam's eager face when they fixed the old bike together in the garage. He pictured Emily, exhausted but still smiling, still strong, still the woman who had once been his everything. And suddenly his penthouse felt cold. His empire felt empty. This life, this messy, imperfect, infuriating life, had given him something he had never had before. A family, love, purpose. Daniel clenched his fists. He had spent years chasing the wrong thing. The old man watched him, patient, silent. He already knew the answer before Daniel even spoke. With a long, steady breath, Daniel made his choice. I'm staying. The words left his lips with a certainty he hadn't felt in years. The old man nodded, his expression full of something Daniel couldn't quite place. Approval, perhaps. Are you sure? He asked. Daniel's jaw tightened. Yes. No hesitation. No regrets. This, Emily, his children, the life he had built here. This was what mattered. The old man smiled, almost as if he had expected this outcome all along. Then just like that, he was gone. No flash of light, no dramatic farewell. Just gone. And Daniel? Daniel stood there, the cold winter air nipping at his skin, but for the first time he felt truly warm inside. Daniel woke up to the soft hum of the city. He felt the warmth of the blankets around him, the smoothness of the silk sheets, the familiar scent of his high-end cologne lingering in the air. For a split second, he forgot everything. Then, his eyes snapped open. The ceiling above him wasn't the slightly cracked one in the small suburban bedroom. The mattress beneath him wasn't lumpy or worn. It was perfect, tailored to his comfort. The room was silent, too silent. No baby crying. No footsteps pattering down the hall. No Emily humming in the kitchen. Daniel shot up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. His gaze darted around the room. His penthouse. The massive, sprawling, expensive penthouse. His pulse hammered in his ears as he threw off the covers, stepping onto the cool marble floor. He rushed to the living room hoping to see toys scattered around. A mess. Signs of life. But it was pristine, cold, empty. His breath hitched. This wasn't right. This wasn't what he chose. He turned toward the kitchen, his hands gripping the counter for support. On instinct, he checked his phone. The date? Weeks had passed. Weeks that, in this world, never happened. Daniel's fingers trembled. He had stayed. He had made his choice. He had chosen them. But now, they were gone. A sharp, unbearable ache filled his chest. He reached for his phone again, his hands shaking as he searched for Emily's number. It wasn't there. His throat tightened. His breathing grew uneven. He tried searching online. Emily Lawson, Vermont, kids, anything. Nothing. No record. No trace. As if they had never existed, Daniel stumbled back, gripping the edge of the counter. For the first time in his life, surrounded by everything he had ever worked for, he felt completely, utterly alone. Daniel walked into Carter Holdings, the towering skyscraper that bore his name, like he had done 1,000 times before. But today, everything felt different. The marble floors, the sleek glass walls, the quiet hum of power. Once, all of it had given him a sense of control, of purpose. Now it just felt cold. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter," his assistant Tyler greeted him as he stepped out of the private elevator onto the executive floor. "I took care of all your postponed meetings while you were away. There's a call waiting from the Tokyo office and—" Daniel wasn't listening. The office was just as he had left it. Immaculate, efficient, perfect. But it was wrong. Tyler followed him into his corner office, still rattling off the agenda. "You also have a lunch meeting with the investors at—" Daniel raised a hand, silencing him. "Cancel it." Tyler blinked. "Excuse me?" "Cancel everything." Tyler stared. "Sir, are you feeling okay?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the skyline stretching beneath him. New York, his empire. Everything he had ever wanted. And yet, it felt meaningless. He could still hear Emily's laugh in the back of his mind. Still feel the warmth of his daughter curled up beside him. Still remember the weight of his son looking up to him, trusting him. But they were gone. And without them, none of this mattered. The deals, the power, the money. He had spent his entire life believing that this was happiness, that this was winning. Now, standing at the top of the world, he felt like he had lost everything. Tyler shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, Do you want me to reschedule for... Daniel turned sharply. Tell me something, Tyler, he said, voice quieter than usual. Do you ever feel like you have everything, but somehow nothing at all? Tyler hesitated, caught off guard. Uh, no, sir. I love my job. Daniel gave a dry chuckle. Right, of course you do. Tyler looked like he wanted to say more, but Daniel had already turned away. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. For the first time in his life, Daniel Carter didn't know what he was doing. He had everything, and yet he had never felt emptier. Daniel couldn't accept it. He wasn't going to just sit in his glass tower and pretend everything was fine. So he did the only thing that made sense. He searched for her. At first, it seemed impossible. Emily Lawson was a common name, and the version of her from his other life didn't exist here. No photos, no kids, no quiet home in Vermont. But he didn't give up. Days turned into weeks as he dug through every resource he had. Old connections, social media, corporate records. He used every trick he had ever used in business. But this time, it wasn't about money or power. It was about finding her. And then finally, he did. A news article. Renowned attorney Emily Lawson joins international firm set to relocate to Paris. Daniel's heart dropped. Paris, she was leaving. Leaving the country. Leaving any chance he had to fix this. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and ran. He found her at the airport. She was standing near the gate, checking her ticket, her long brown hair tied in a loose bun. She looked different, sharper, more confident, more like the woman he had known years ago, before she had become his wife, before the house and the kids and the life he had just lost. Daniel's chest tightened. For a split second, he hesitated. What if she didn't remember him? What if she was happier here, without him, without the family they had built in another life? But then she turned, and for the briefest moment, her eyes met his. She froze. Recognition flickered in her expression, but it wasn't the warm, familiar look he had been aching for. It was confusion. Daniel, she asked, frowning. Daniel swallowed hard. God, she was right there, and yet she felt miles away. Emily, he breathed, stepping forward. I need to talk to you. Emily hesitated, glancing at her boarding pass. Now? Yes, he said, urgent, desperate. Please. Something in his voice must have gotten to her, because she slowly nodded, stepping away from the gate. Daniel exhaled. This was it, his only chance to fix everything. Daniel's hands shook as he sat across from Emily in the busy airport lounge. Flights were being announced over the speakers. People bustled around them, suitcases rolling across the tile floor. But he didn't hear any of it. All he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat. Emily sat with her back straight, watching him carefully. She looked composed, but there was something in her eyes, something unsure. So, she said slowly, what was so important that you ran all the way to an airport just to stop me? Daniel exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. Where did he even begin? He could tell her the truth, the insane, impossible truth, that in another life they were married, that they had a house, a family, children who loved them, that he had chosen them over everything, only to wake up and find them gone. He searched her face, looking for some flicker of recognition, some piece of the Emily he had known. But she just stared back at him, waiting. I know this is going to sound crazy, he said finally, his voice raw. But I lost you, and now that I found you again, I can't just let you walk away. Emily frowned. Lost me? Daniel, we haven't spoken in years. In this life, maybe, he admitted. But in another, we had everything. A home, a life, kids. And his voice caught. I didn't realize what I had until it was gone. Emily's lips parted slightly, her eyes searching his face. Daniel, you don't have to believe me, he said quickly, desperate for her to understand. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe I've lost my mind. But I know what I felt. I know what we had, and I know that I don't want to lose you again. Emily swallowed, looking away for a moment. Her fingers toyed with the corner of her boarding pass. Daniel, that was a dream, she said softly. You don't even know who I really am. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, then slowly, he smiled. Then let me start over, he said. Let me get to know you again. Emily's breath hitched. The overhead speaker announced her flight. For a second, Daniel thought she was going to stand up, say goodbye, and walk away. But then, finally, she smiled back. And that was enough. Emily glanced at the boarding gate, then back at Daniel. Her flight was boarding. She had a choice to make. For a long moment, she just studied him. The Daniel Carter she remembered was ambitious, untouchable, always in control. The kind of man who never looked back, never chased anything that wasn't already his. But this Daniel, he looked different. There was something raw in his expression, something real. His hands were clenched, his breathing uneven, like he had just sprinted through hell to get here. Like he actually cared. Emily hesitated. She should just go. She should walk away, board her flight, and leave him in the past where he belonged. But something in her wouldn't let her. She exhaled. All right, she said finally. You've got 10 minutes. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Emily gestured toward a quiet seating area near the window. Let's talk. She sat down, crossing her legs, her boarding pass still held loosely between her fingers. Daniel sat across from her, relief washing over him. He hadn't won her back, not yet, but he had something even more important, a second chance. The airport buzzed with movement around them, but for Daniel, the world had gone still. Emily sat across from him in a quiet corner of a small cafe just outside the terminal. No first-class lounges, no rushed goodbyes, just them. Two people who once meant everything to each other, now strangers again. Daniel wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, the warmth grounding him. He had spent years believing he knew exactly what he wanted, what mattered, but now, sitting here, he realized this was the first real conversation he had had in a long time. So, Emily said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, you seriously expect me to believe that in some alternate reality, we were married, had kids, built a life together? Daniel didn't flinch. Yes. Emily let out a small, disbelieving laugh. And I gave up my career for that life? Daniel hesitated. You didn't give up anything, he said carefully. You chose it. We built something together. He exhaled, shaking his head. And I was too blind to see how much it meant until it was gone. Emily fell silent. For a long moment, she just watched him, as if trying to decide whether he was completely insane or telling the truth in a way she couldn't explain. Finally, she sighed, setting her spoon down. You know what's crazy? Daniel leaned forward slightly. What? Emily's lips curved into a small, unreadable smile. For some reason, I believe you. Daniel's heart stuttered. Emily took a slow sip of her coffee, then placed the cup down and met his eyes. But even if all of that were true, she continued, her voice quieter now, that wasn't this life. This me doesn't know you. This me doesn't have any reason to trust you. Daniel nodded, accepting that truth. He had lost her once. He wasn't going to rush this. Then let me earn it, he said simply. Emily tilted her head. You sure about that? Daniel chuckled under his breath. I don't think I've ever been more sure of anything. Emily studied him for a long moment. Then slowly she smiled. Outside, snow was falling gently against the cafe window, coating the city in white. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Carter wasn't thinking about what came next. He was just here, with her. And that was enough. The cafe was warm, filled with the soft hum of quiet conversations and the occasional clatter of cups against saucers. Outside, the snow continued to fall, coating the streets of New York in a quiet, gentle white. Daniel and Emily sat across from each other, their hands wrapped around their cups, the steam curling between them like whispers of a past neither of them fully understood. For the first time in years, they weren't two people caught in different worlds. They were just Daniel and Emily. Not CEO and lawyer, not strangers bound by some impossible, forgotten life. Just two people, sharing coffee, starting over. Emily leaned back, her fingers tapping lightly against her cup. So, she said, tilting her head, amusement flickering in her eyes. Let's say I do believe you. Let's say, somehow, all of this is real. What happens next? Daniel smiled. Something real. Something soft. I don't know. Emily raised an eyebrow. Daniel Carter, the man with a plan for everything, doesn't know? He let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. For once, no. He met her gaze, steady and sure. But I do know one thing. Emily arched a brow. Oh? Daniel took a slow breath, his chest lighter than it had felt in years. I'm not going to let you go again, he said. Emily's smile was small at first, almost hesitant, but then for the first time in years, she truly smiled at him. And just like that, the world shifted. Not because of fate, not because of magic, but because for the first time in his life, Daniel Carter had made the right choice. The cafe door opened, the cold air rushing in as new customers entered. But Daniel and Emily stayed where they were, talking, laughing, beginning. And as the snow fell outside, a second chance unfolded before them.